So, Cliff, the film is something useful. What did you think?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I should have really enjoyed this film because if you told me what this film was about, I would really like the sound of it. So, you know, it's a very gentle film that feels like a really slow, poetic journey. There's a real sense of movement. It's slow, but it never stops moving. And that's really emphasized quite cleverly, I think, by the we often hear the rattle of the train tracks, and we see the different scenery going past, and so it is slow, but there is the sense of the journey somewhere, and it's very satisfying. And actually, it made me think a few times, although it's a completely different film, of Europa by Lars von Trier, which is just on a almost all set on a train, and just the constant soundtrack of the clickety click of the wheels on the track. Very different film, but just employed the same technique of just giving you this sense of this relentless kind of going forward. But in this case, it was very gentle. Um, you know, there's something lovely. The poetry really comes in all of the incidental people and incidental conversations that she overhears or that she gets involved in, and that's all very satisfying. And then this repeating image of the graffiti artist, kind of, I think he's drawing on existing images of birds. I don't think he's done them all. He's defacing other people's graffiti, but that's kind of interesting. I like the fact that she's a lawyer and a poet, and
Mm.
kind of this logical versus creative thing, which I really relate to. Um, she's going to a social event, but there's a real sense in that that's not why that's not what the film is about. That's not why she's on the train. That was an excuse to get her on the train. But actually her trip, she didn't know it was about something completely different than the social event is completely irrelevant to her trip. She was supposed to be on that train. She was supposed to meet the young girl, and you know the social event was just a device to get her on the train. I liked that. I love the fact that the film ends with a death, and it is about death. There's a lot of discussion about this man's death, but it's totally in keeping with the rest of the film. It's not morbid at all. It really is gentle, poetic, and beautiful. And when we finally meet the paralyzed man who wants to die, he's he's very happy. He's very peaceful. He lives in a beautiful place, and Layla really connects with him. And there's it just although it ends in a death, the film, it doesn't. It's totally in keeping with how gentle and poetic this film is. So, if you told me that that's what this film was about, I would think, God, that sounds like a fantastic film. I'm really going to enjoy that. And, it is about all those things, and it successfully does those things. But I just didn't feel any emotional connection with this film at all. I kind of feel that given that description of it, I should have felt some emotions at the end. I didn't feel anything at the end. I felt I had the thought, am I supposed to be feeling emotional at this? Because I just felt cold. It didn't. I felt detached from it. I don't think there's any warmth in this film, even though it's very gentle. Um, I think part of that is that we never go deeper with Layla. We do with the other character. Is her name, is it pronounced Chanan, or it's Canan, isn't it? It's we do with the younger character. We maybe get a little bit more about her background. We get very little about Layla. We don't really know what her story is, and I think that maybe her that lack of any depth to her is what made me feel, no emotional connection to her at all. um when the young girl says, why are you here, why are you so fascinated with this, we don't really know why. And I think in some ways that film that I was describing earlier that I would like to see, I think that we would know a little bit more. I feel that I really wanted to know a little bit more about her motivation. It really feels like we know so little about her. I think that the cello and the poetry just felt so contrived. It felt like it was trying to be an arty, earnest film, and it works. There's something very beautiful about the cello, and when we see the cellist on the floor above, it's beautifully shot. They're beautiful images. The cello sounds beautiful. The poetry sounds good, but I don't know. It just felt, when we heard her reading her poetry, that just felt really contrived. I do have to acknowledge, and I've mentioned this to you before, I have a personal problem listening to poetry. I kind of feel stressed in listening to poetry that I need to understand it. And as soon as I have that thought, I kind of have a block to understanding it. So every time she was reading her writing, I lost it. I trying to listen for meaning, and I lost it. So that's not the film's fault. That's my fault. Um, but at some level, the fact that her reading this poem or this bit of writing at the end of the film, it felt like that was really critical to the end of the film. And I just think that ending a film with a poem, it wasn't the last shot, the poem, but it was at the end, the sense of her wrapping up what this film was about in a poem. I kind of had that sense, and it just lost me. And it feels, you know, for me, cinema is something visual, and it's like just reading a poem it feels like a bit of a cop out. And I have to accept that may just be for me, but overall, I quite enjoyed the journey. I was never bored by this film. I quite enjoyed it. It was good to look at, and it was poetic, but I found it a cold experience. I think if we'd have gone to see this at a Curzon cinema in London, we would have found it a kind of arty, earnest experience. It does kind of fit the bill for an art house cinema, but I didn't quite connect with it.
Wow, it's almost painful. Almost painful to hear you talk about. It doesn't happen often with me, but sometimes I watch a film that I connect with on such a level that I feel a kind of kinship with it.
Mm.
And to hear people not enjoy it just makes my heart break a little bit. I loved it. I was so delighted by this movie, and it was one of those beautiful experiences of not knowing anything about the filmmaker or anything about the film, and just very, very quickly falling in love with it. And I think from the very opening sequence, it sets out its stall in a really beautiful way, because it opens with her. She's standing outside the train station, kind of pacing behind these glass doors. So she's kind of removed from the action and yet commenting on it in voiceover. And then in the foreground, you've got this couple doing these really cheesy wedding photos. And and from that point onwards, the film continues to treat art and poetry with a real seriousness that is nonetheless grounded in a profoundly human, unpretentious, modest kind of enjoyment of life. And I think these are the qualities that I think characterize the whole film for me. That above all, there was a sense of humility and maturity in the film. It had it was so mature and effortless that I just found it completely spellbinding. There was and I think you're right when some of the things, when you describe them, they shouldn't work, you know, like how do you shoot poetry in a film? Well, you have someone stand on a train and the lights glittering past in the window and then someone reading poetry on the side. It sounds terrible, right? It sounds terrible and it shouldn't work. And yet for me, it did. It just completely had me. I think I disagree about the fact about the reason why she's there. I don't think it's that we don't know why she's there. I think in fact that it's typical of the film that actually what's happening there is it's capturing a really interesting moral ambiguity, but doing so with such a light touch that perhaps it's easy to miss. But I think the reason she is there to begin with is is out of a kind of puerile fascination. And I think that's a really interesting comment on writing, on the life of the writing. You know, this fascination with the world. If the writing is good and truthful, then it's motivated, yes, through a kind of compassion and love for other people. But there's no doubt that to be an artist, there is also just a kind of a fascination with the world that's almost got an almost amoral objectivity. You know, I think she's there because she is fascinated by the idea of this young girl killing this guy. You know, now morally, that's really kind of troubling situation to be in, and her humanity gets the better of her, and she realizes that actually the reason they are there is to keep him talking. You know, we'll come back tomorrow, and we'll come back tomorrow, and we'll come back tomorrow. And the something useful of the title is poetry. And what a beautiful sentiment. You know, she ends the film with the poem because that is the something useful. That's what she gives to the world, you know, and it has a practical effect. It changes that guy's attitude towards his life, you know. And I thought this film reminded me of things like Kieślowski's, like Double Life of Veronique, and the Jean-Pierre and Luc Dardenne, their early stuff. I think it had that level of profound humanity, and also that kind of moral ambiguity, the writer being fascinated by things that make the sort of cast them in a strange light, reminded me a bit of, I mean, that's a major theme of Through a Glass Darkly, the Bergman. But what contrasts this film probably most markedly from all those things I've just mentioned is that this film is, as you said, has a lightness of touch. It is overall gentle. You know, it deals with these very big, weighty themes, but it doesn't do it in a sort of Bergman-esque kind of Christ, isn't life difficult and depressing sort of way. It does it with this fantastic lightness of touch, which I just thought was completely beguiling. So I loved it. I enjoyed it more than anything I've seen for a really, really long time.
Did you appreciate the poetry then? Did you listen to the poetry, and did that add to your understanding of what was going on in the film?
I'm in two minds about poetry and film as well. Now, I think the obvious reference for me, because it's just, we seem to talk about Tarkovsky every week, but of course, most Tarkovsky films are full of his father's poetry, right? And a similar thing happens with me. I start to think, oh, what's the significance of the poem? And then I, and often I can't find one, you know, just generally, not in this film, just generally. I'm not sure that the content of the poem adds anything to the film. But what does happen, I thought, with this one is that the act of reading poetry, the act of performing, the meditative nature of it, the thoughtfulness and the observational nature of the practice is what infuses the film with a kind of atmosphere. And so it almost doesn't matter what the meaning of the poem is. It's just to get a kind of fragmentary sense of what she's talking about. And I certainly don't think there's any need to, or probably any value really in, oh, pause and hang on a minute, let me have a think and perform some kind of exegesis on the poem. I don't think that's necessary at all. You know, it's just about adding to the atmosphere of the piece, in the same way that the lighting adds to the atmosphere and the gliding camera work. And, you know, the poetry is just another aspect, a technical aspect of the filmmaking aesthetic in this film.
Yeah, I can see that if I let go of trying to find meaning in the poem and just let it be. But I think in this film to have such a chunk of, I mean, I think it was the longest chunk of her reading her poetry at the end of the film as the kind of climax. I just thought that was, you know, that really didn't work for me at
It's a
all.
shame, because I think if you know, you talked about motivation, and not being able to sort of really attach to her sense of motivation, and I think in a way it's very bold to say that what she stands for is her writing, you know, that that is the explanation for her. The fact that the longest thing she says is to read out a really long poem, I think that tells us everything we need to know about her and her, you know, to be a devoted artist, but a quiet one who has a kind of, she has a, you know, a professional life, and she's quite reticent about admitting to being a poet. But you're right, when she does speak, the longest speech she gives is devoted to her poetry. And I think that tells us a huge amount about her. Not necessarily what she reads to us, but the fact that she does so and for such a long period of time, you know?
Yeah, you see, I feel quite sad that the film didn't work for me, because when you describe that, you know, that this is a film about an artist and her work, really, you know, at some fundamental level, you know, I really appreciate that idea. I really appreciate someone making a film about that. And yeah, I'm sad that it didn't work for me. I what I did really enjoy this film was about this film was her, you know, the sense of joy throughout it. There was a sense of the joy of life. I mean, I think you mentioned that. Um, you know, I loved that conversation on the train when the two other women came and joined them, and that was really, um, you know, well written, well acted. You know, it was mundane conversation, but it was compelling viewing. I really enjoyed that, and there was just, you know, it was the kind of scene where at the end of it, you know, I kind of felt like going on a train and chatting with people. You know, I wanted to have those, I wanted to be in those conversations. So I think that, yeah, and we often saw Layla smiling when she saw the couple with the wedding photos. And, you know, when she would see different people from the train, she would smile. So, you know, there was a joy of just living and noticing small things, and I really appreciated that. And you know, I guess you could see that she was constantly, you know, aware of things and connecting with the world. But you know, I guess I just feel a bit dissatisfied because she seemed so disconnected. She seemed so disconnected from the world. You know, she was always looking in on other people. She was always on the other side of the glass, looking, you know, on, you know, from the train, looking at people in all different towns and in apartment blocks. And, you know,
But
she was
don't you,
never
don't you think there's,
connecting.
there's something really important about the artist, or certainly a particular type of artist, that, you know, to be compelled to sort of detach from life in order to observe it and comment on it, you know, that's a really interesting fact of life for certain artists, you know. And there's that, and I think that's what accounts for that ambiguity and the shift in motivations when she is there with that guy. Because as I say, to begin with, she's not doing anything noble there.
No.
She is fully prepared to go there with that young girl and help that young girl kill that guy, and she's going to go and watch. And you know, that's a really kind of troubling setup. But obviously that's not what happens. But that reversal in her motivation, I think, typically doesn't occur at the point of any kind of climax, or she doesn't start to scrutinize her motives and then think, hang on a minute, this isn't, do you know what I mean? I think it's typical of not just the film's maturity, but the character's maturity. She is comfortable enough in herself that this thing that is actually a bit alarming doesn't alarm her. She is obviously
Yeah.
well used to this idea of, you know, this is how I live my life, and I've kind of made my peace with that. And yet she is open and honest enough that when there is the opportunity to instead actually save that guy, she does not hesitate to do so.
Mm.
You know. And the last thing I would say about the film's maturity, I thought that, and I've mentioned this before, I think it was in the context of Farewell Amore, that I think sometimes there is something really admirable. It's about taking quite a conventional cinematic structure, you know, because the story for this is really simple and fairly kind of cliche almost. You know, two strangers happen to meet by chance on a long journey, and they go on not just a physical journey but an emotional journey together. And do you know what I mean? Like on
Mm.
paper it sounds quite schematic, and I think there's sometimes something really mature about saying, I'm going to tell this really simple story. I'm not going to try and do anything particularly clever or flashy with it. I'm going to use this really simple structure in order to tell quite a straightforward story about ordinary people, but and somehow elevate all of it. You know, it's like that. I guess, you know, the Virginia Woolf, the modernist kind of thing of paying attention to the quotidian, but somehow elevating it so that it becomes kind of transcendent. You know, I'm doing my best to talk you around here because I loved this film.
Yeah. So this one we don't completely agree on, but
Not completely.
worth, I would say worth watching, and you'd highly recommend it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, good. So what are we watching next?
Next up is Uppercase Print by Radu Jude.
Great.